So I am somewhat of an unlikely speaker at a methods workshop, since I usually just say something like, I talk to Nazis in the hope your grandkids won't have to. But here I am very pleased to talk about critical reflexivity and the exploration of the online-offline nexus through stories of blended ethnographic fieldwork on right-wing femininity in education I conducted a couple years back for my dissertation. This is a method which I think can be understood as digital methods in a deep interpretivist way. Since the talk is about me, since the talk is about critical reflexivity and not about me, let me present myself, however. I'm moderately good at a couple of things. This is not, in fact, giving presentations, unfortunately, but I'm pretty good at writing pointed descriptions of things I dislike, some relatively lucid semiotic analysis, and that's more or less it. So today I'm going to talk about the online-offline nexus using this. I hope you find some of what I say productive. It's been relatively productive for me. About 15 publications, a few talks. My most recent is in Language, Culture, and Society, Granola Nazis and the Great Reset. In this work and talks on aesthetics, branding, and gender on the right, I'm interested in the connection of metapragmatics and metapolitics, how ideologies connect to practices and to discourses. So this builds on my dissertation, now a book under contract with Routledge's Fascism in the Far Right series for early next year. This research was conducted in Facebook groups, Instagram, and the suburbs of New Orleans, Louisiana, where I looked at the discourses of gender, language, and schooling from far right and Christian nationalist women who homeschooled their kids, as well as conservative public school teachers at places formerly called stuff like Robert E. Lee Elementary. The book spoke back to Arlie Russell Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, which was conducted nearby, and called racism a deep story. I ask instead how that story got there and who taught it. So I guess this explores the online-offline nexus, but also the conservative far-right nexus. I care about this mainly because my mother went from natural health to Nazism, radicalized through both a combination of peak oil forums and eco-fascism, whatever was in her apple cider vinegar, and her own experiences as a housewife who embraced traditional gender roles, or so-called traditional gender roles anyway. So all of this is relevant because I'm talking about critical reflexivity, not just because I like trashing my mom. Critical reflexivity here is more than simply introspection. It is a look at the self that has as its object of inquiry the social world, social power, and processes of knowledge construction. This is an iterative process, describes constant and shifting the moving representation of an object through the constant reformulation and expression of its use and meaning by Bourdieu scholar Cécile Dier, who continues, it is accompanied by parallel illustrations of its practically grounded scientific and epistemological relevance and significance. So then, of course, critical reflexivity draws from Bourdieu's 1992 work of reflexive sociology, and in particular turns on his concept of epistemic reflexivity, which aims not at undermining or deconstructing foundations, but using reflexivity to increase the scope and solidity of social scientific knowledge. So in Bourdieu's reflections on the end of his career, he argues that bringing sociology and self-analysis together, looking at his own milieu as well as what he's investigating, shapes a socio-analysis which brings together theoretical reflection with the sharpness of empirical observation. So in this talk, I'm not going to aim so high, but I am going to try to bring this idea of critical reflexivity as socio-analysis, that is, again, looking at your own experience to be critical, to see broader systems of social inequality, bring this to bear on digital ethnography. Digital ethnography is said by my mentor, Julie Hemmant, chair of anthropology now at UMass, to be beginning with herself as an internet user, but making it critical and connected. I want to explore this as a method across multiple phases of research, always with a focus on writing. Writing as an iterative, reflexive social analysis, described by Bourdieu as well as critical feminist anthropologist Reid Danahay as an anti-biography. Writing anti-biographies, drawing on and deepening ethnographic traditions of field notes, and writing really thick description to do exactly this constant construction and reformulation of an object. This is thick description rich with affect or theory, illusion. It is not judgment-free, but is instead aiming to write with what Susan Gall terms moral flavor, looking at how sensory qualities intersect with ideology. Put more simply, write 2,000 words a day, every single day. So normally my talks are narrative, they have jokes, I mock the bad history and Nazi constructions of our heroic register as they play act Lord of the Rings, but today I'm going to do my very best to keep it serious and start with an outline. I'm going to begin with an intro of the far right as a case for the importance of critical ethnographic explorations of the online-offline nexus, and then I will show how critical reflexivity can happen in 4 steps: research design, methods, analysis, and writing. Each of these will begin with an example of anti-biographic writing, have a more prescriptive point or two, and then conclude. I will end the talk with steps forward, not just my own, but also those of other researchers whose work I admire. So we are all reflexive now. American anthropological and sociological writing emphasizes reflexivity, or at least positionality, and narrative writing, which situates the ethnographer in the text. But I want to argue that although in fashion we are not doing it well enough. Looking at reflexivity in two works from sociology and media studies of the far right, Hochschild and Francesca Tripodi's recent book. I want to use this work on the far right as a case study to speak about the broader lacunae in our understandings of criticality and ethnography. So first, Arlie Russell Hochschild went to Louisiana, the same place I did, to study the right, but she somehow found very different things there. She writes herself into the story as a model of overcoming what she terms an empathy wall, the imagined vast distance between a liberal college professor and working class Louisianans that she chose as representative of the far right. I found, rather, that the distances were much less vast. Several of the far-right homeschooling mothers I studied had advanced degrees in law, astrophysics, Latin, or theology, but also that empathy with them was less than desirable. In a forthcoming chapter written with Ray Horeza, we argue that this form of understanding ethnography as empathy, or relationship building, rather than knowledge production through thick description, relies on what we term emotional objectivity and is rather scholarly weak and rooted in a dubious presumption that the far right are a distant other. This distance must be overcome through empathy, and through that only we will find knowledge. But her book does not seem to produce much knowledge, rather a weak discussion of the deep story of conservatives. If you didn't read this book, and since you're not in far right studies, you perhaps didn't, their story is that Black people are cutting in line. This is neither deep nor a story. I don't need to tell you this. We have several experts in here on what is a story. Hochschild talks about the stories, though it is innate, ignoring all that we know as language scholars about how stories get there. Instead, this is a call to ethnography to directly access people's experiences through empathy, a gendered vision of emotional nurture, the ethnographer as trad wife. I'm not sure how the woman who wrote The Managed Heart ended up suggesting that we do emotional therapy for Nazis. But in this talk today, I'm going to introduce methods designed to do the opposite, look at how stories get there and what they do. Okay. We have critique, not empathy, and a focus on the circulation of discourse. Second, as this is a talk on the online-offline nexus, I guess I should talk about media. So here, Francesca Tripodi's work on far-right media, whose statement on reflexivity is pictured here on the screen. And I'm not saying this book is bad. Tripodi's is quite an interesting look at conservative media and the influence of both platforms and religious interpretation techniques on news reception. It would be great if it had been written by a linguistic anthropologist. Truly wonderful. So she studied conservative media, and she writes of her own whiteness, which made the research possible. But at the same time, she states that she had to transmogrify herself into a Chick-fil-A eating, flats-wearing, modest lump in order to connect to her participants. Here, her reflexivity also remains about how she built relationships and blended into what she imagines her participants are. We learn very little about the right from this, but a lot about what Tripodi thinks they are. A conservative is named Fran or Franny. She cannot pronounce Francesca, is dumpy, wears pearls, eat fried food. So here are some pictures of these authors and some women of the very far right. I mean, you wouldn't mix them up, but they definitely all shop at the same stores. You don't need an empathy bridge, you're all at the same mall. The whiteness these women mentioned does not stop at a census category, but also shows up in how they dress. Perhaps also some of their understandings of beauty, gender, their shared desires, practices, values. It is through these that far-right values can become part of a horizon of interpretation, can be taken up. These overlaps could reveal areas of empathy with the right, or, as I might argue, areas of the mainstream we could condemn. And lest you think I'm exempting myself, the blonde on the right is named Kat. And I would probably wear that necklace, even though the rest of her look is a bit too rent-fair for me. So to me, this similarity then is an object of analysis, a way to understand normalization and mainstreaming. It's not a way to make friends. I already have 3 of those. So to sum up quickly, I want to say that what this look at the right shows more broadly is the need to move away from empathy and reflexivity as forms of relationality, the gendered performance of emotional objectivity rendered in smooth Chardonnay narratives as a standard of ethnography, and back towards centering the practice of thick description that blends social and self-analysis, which I'll try to do in the rest of this talk. So in my first semester of graduate school, I was required to take a methods class. Introduction to Research, which was supposed to do what it said. In the first class, the senior professor in the department taught the difference between theoretical orientations, frameworks, and methodologies by drawing a series of umbrellas on the board. The largest at the top was named orientation. Underneath a medium-sized umbrella was framework. A smaller one was methods, and underneath this hierarchy of umbrellas lay our research questions and our design. I wasn't so much puzzled by the research methods, but I did wonder why there were umbrellas. It was only later, conducting my dissertation research, that I realized that this image was drawn from fundamentalist Christianity's umbrellas of authority, also known as the natural order of the family. Popularized by proponent of biblical patriarchy and homeschooler Bill Gothard, the umbrella expresses the idea of being under authority, the protection that comes from submission and obedience to who is above you, and the suffering if you do not. The biggest authority is God, then man, then woman, then child, expressing the dictum that women should love their husbands the way their husbands love God. Their idea is that life exists in a hierarchy, that there is no natural equality any more than there is between man and God. So gender was then used to illustrate hierarchy, and hierarchy was shown to be the core of knowledge production. Revelation is godly, theory is male, and applied research was for us little girls. The more complex part of my dissertation research then was not to understand what this umbrella meant, but why this mattered for the mainstream, and what it was doing in a research methods at a class at a university that used to be called UMarks, in a state that always voted Democrat blue. So in my work, I explore how some of the stuff of far-right femininity has threads in some of these very unlikely places, some subtle, some sexy, some beloved, some banal, and how these are wound together, naturalized, and invested with meaning in right-wing women's discourses. I look at their surprising connections with educational research and practice, and the way these form a new kind of alt-education that is gaining increasing currency across the right. So these aims then shape a critical reflexivity in research design. At the online-offline nexus, which I'm going to try to illustrate here by using some of the images from the Instagram that I'd used during my fieldwork, during my road trip to the South. I hope you find them interesting and a fun illustration of another way that we are always on the online-offline nexus. Okay, so I'm sitting with my dad and all my worldly possessions in the Subaru. He's driving to the field site south down some highway or another is named after some good boy, lined with thin pine trees, long stretches of yellowing grass punctuated by auto accident and anti-abortion billboards. He plays condescending common sense podcasts and boomer music, and I grit my teeth quietly. He takes me to an old country buffet, the fine exporter of Southern culture to your local strip mall. We stop in Georgia, I get some peaches. They are beautiful but mealy. We eat an ice cream next to a Sons of the Confederate Veterans Memorial. Above us, a billboard advertises the school board elections, an impressive level of community engagement in the machinery of segregation. We hit the Mississippi line, and I play Mississippi Goddamn as I record the view for my Insta story. We stop at a roadside gas station buffet with sun-beaten 50s signage and a broken-down shed that looks like it's committed murder. Inside, several couples with a gaze older and colder than their fried chicken and ambrosia salad stare until they irradiate my back. I flee to the shop in search of snacks, not to find wrapped chips and moon pies, but boiled peanuts and rows of Confederate flag merchandise. Shower curtains, towels, hats in pink for her. An ethnographic feast. It's stomach-churning, but it's kind of fun. I'd found every northerner's idea of the far right, or perhaps just the South, with Cletus the slack-jawed yokel and his fat wife. And the truth is, the South is built on enslavement and white supremacy, not just Confederate memorials, but banks built on old slave auction houses, plantation houses, and waffle houses staffed by black folks making $2 an hour. Everywhere the Civil War is an absent presence. You drive down Lee Highway or to Jefferson Davis Parish. Thank you. Woven into the landscape like Spanish moss covering trees and the ghosts of lynchings. You drive by plantations offering tours and 4th of July parties long gone by. It is here the idea of the belle with her southern charm and beauty began the slow process of dressing up whiteness as ideal womanhood, the cult of domesticity, the romanticization of segregation, by the angel of the home, today's family values or feminine charm. Southern women are said to still be the most socially conservative of any group, and with every God bless, I feel as though I can smell it. But it's also true that the Deep South is a trope, an incinerator where us good northern girls leave all the racism, blaming it on those poor, benighted rural folks who never got their liberal arts education. It's a class slur, like when a woman walking down the street near UMass referred to a poor neighborhood as basically a red state. I don't want to become a kale-toting, supercilious northern lib looking for a red that is a Republican, not a commie, but I enjoy this blurring. a fat blonde other, a Chick-fil-A guzzling Jesus-loving mama who shops at Dress Barn. I don't want to repeat these cliches of racists as long-lost people stuck behind empathy walls. They live, in fact, in her book, on top of a salt bubble filled with industrial waste. Perhaps we should talk about this. But not all racists are strangers. Massachusetts has them too, those social Darwinist doctors sipping Negronis and relating just so stories about the Pleistocene or duck vaginas to justify my subordination. Folks yelling racial slurs at my date or smiling at us like they accomplished something by approving. It was really not even a great first date. We didn't have a second one. Don't tell the farmers market fascists using the language of evolution and nature instead of Jesus and gospel. The echoes of our eugenicist past are not so distant with every judgment of a stranger's grocery cart at the co-op. My dad doesn't accept abortion or trans rights. He loves pretty women who bring him food and would prefer a wedding to a dissertation defense, and he's my liberal parent. A voting record as blue as the ones ethnographers of the right mention as their inalienable difference from the Cletuses of the world. So I was also raised in this cult of domesticity, tried to be well-groomed, soft-spoken, male-oriented. I was never very good at it, but it's as much a part of me as it is the Southern beauty queen. Here I am with my daddy, looking for the pro-patriarchy women. The irony should not be lost on the reader. So, as this perhaps overly reflexive text shows, my research aimed to bring together analysis of my own social milieu and that of my field site. The text was trying to show the journey to the field, but also problematizing the ways in which I had constructed that field site. So here I want to say that critical reflexivity should begin at research design, what is designated a field or an object of inquiry. I have a broad theoretical interest in the normalization and circulation of far-right ideologies, which, along with this critical orientation, shaped how I understood my role as a researcher, to use my own experience as part of these chains of circulation, and how I understood my field sites and the relationship between on and offline, which of course meant a blended ethnography. Digital linguistic anthropology, from Bolstorff to Jonathan Rosa, operates on a continuum, some looking at the field as a self-contained digital community as in Second Life, others like Rosa's hashtag ethnography, seeing the internet as part of broader communication and real politics. To be fair, politics are everywhere, even the Front National has an office in Second Life. So I designed a blended ethnography which would instead explore the multiplicity of connections between digital and physical, using a series of different sites, some very contained, such as these Facebook groups, and some more diffuse, such as Instagram, as well as participant observation at places like the Daughter of the Confederacy Museum, Logos Elementary School Parents' Day, and interviews with a bunch of very smart, very bad moms. This was ethnography as reiterating reflections on a set of objects, on right-wing femininity, right-wing discourse across the chain of circulation, production, uptake, and transmission, with a special focus on how it is taught. So to sum up, with a point, critical reflexivity begins in research design. It is in no way an autoethnography, but to borrow a phrase, an ethnography of discursive flows and also of Nazis. So we're about a third of the way into the talk, and we finally see the word method, but I made it most of my life without eating fried green beans, and I survived. So digital research has two main elements for me. Facebook groups, one for each political area of focus, so far-right and Christian nationalists, which were both homeschooler groups, and patriotic public school teachers, as well as an Instagram account. Since I'm sure you guys all know how to use a Facebook group, probably better than I do, I'm going to explain a little bit how I used Instagram. First, Finsta as method. I set up a fake Instagram account using pictures of smoothies and farmers markets. No people were harmed in its making. Followed hashtags like tradlife and anti-feminist influencers, and saw how quickly I was invited to follow open racists, but my focus on mainstreaming doesn't stop there. Instead, I went and I compared this to my own Instagram, which mainly follows communist propaganda and pictures of my friends' cats, sometimes now they're babies. This comparison allowed me to account for the shared stylistic conventions that make this mainstreaming possible. For example, here we can see a mirror selfie that brings together my picture of my new haircut and Bernadine Bluntly's anti-feminist propaganda. We look the same here, but her next post is a picture of a Trojan horse labeled feminism with soldiers inside labeled cultural Marxism. I think both of those sound great, but anyway, our pictures look pretty much the same. Hers are pretty pastel, kind of California hipster minimal femme. Over the just under 1,000 posts I saved, I saw it's not another world, it's not a weird red America, it's a bedroom just like yours, it's soft, it's pretty, there's a kind of aesthetics of normalization. Second, there's something called the 6 degrees method for insta-ethnography. Here I conducted a kind of digital ethnographic exploration of topical links through hashtags and hyperlinks on Instagram to trace the thematic normalization in complement to the focus on aesthetics in the previous method. The name is a play on the game 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, and it traced the actual existing and conceptual links between different posts and accounts, then asked which themes provided the most frequent possibilities of efficient connection to far-right themes. So if I began with an account like Dixieland or the proletariat, it might take infinite clicks to find something racist. But yoga accounts might get you there in 5, health food in 2. But this did not end up getting represented quantitatively because I really don't care. But instead was part of this repeated reflection on an object and represented through narratives of the more frequent and striking thematic links themselves. So not this dating website was 3 links away from neo-Nazis, but exploring how dating websites would emphasize something called romantic polarity, which was then linked to evangelical complementarianism, which then was further radicalized into tradwife media and something called domestic discipline, which I will not tell you about here, but Google it, it's wild. And then you end up at Julius Evola. So to sum up, reflexivity in research methods goes beyond the digital ethnographer's call to start with yourself as an internet user, or what this guy Tom I met says, the medium as method. There is no one medium, it does not impose. Instead, we should be uniting the everyday use of this tech with careful analysis and thick description, which builds on and extends these tools. Okay. So critical reflexivity and research analysis. So here I'm going to briefly discuss some analytic methods, which is basically just the writing of anti-biographies. I'm about to go to the Tea Party Christmas party, an actual out-loud celebration of racism at a tasteless upper-middle-class restaurant, the kind my uncle would refer to as a sit-down place, which is apt because I'm sure this dining is less than fine. The oyster bar could give you chlamydia. Okay, all this sociological talk about empathy walls, but absolutely nothing compares to the awkwardness of being late to a thing you don't want to be at. Breathe, smile, and go. A thin woman shifts her fleece like it's a fur. Someone asked me if I want a domestic or an import beer. I smile and say import, my small act of distinction. I talk about freedom with a former lawyer who quit to homeschool. Her husband stares at my ass, while his neighbor reads Trump's tweets like they are carved on 2 stone tablets. And then a miracle happens. A middle-aged woman in a red onesie and a Santa hat emerges from the crowd at the back. She takes a mic, puts a cassette in the stereo, and begins leading the group in song. To the tune of Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah, they sing, and I will not. We Americans had lost our way as actors in this passion play, but the scales had finally fallen from our blind eyes. Said our founders through enlightenment, to be free, constrain our government, and now it's time to use what we've been given. The Constitution, the Constitution, the Constitution, the Constitution. Can you guys hear the Leonard Cohen in your head a little bit? We gathered round and raised our voice. We realized that we had a choice to stop the degradation of our country. When someone screams, who sings the song of liberty and screams what's wrong, we all must rise to join the revolution. The revolution, the revolution. This, from the warming oysters to the elasticated separates to the sound of the sing-along, this is the appropriate performance of proud Americanness. This is cultural populism for the economic elite. This is its own kind of teaching and learning, a patriotic church, a sermon in nationalism. The Tea Party promotes libertarianism, but as biblical economics. These women celebrate a Christian nation, homeschooling with the Patriots' Bible. This is them singing the Constitution like a hymn, in order to build a world where we read the Bible like a law. So, in the story I just shared a little part of, I'm trying to mix ethnographic observation, not just with my own background, but also social and textual analysis drawn from observation of homeschooling, textual analysis of materials, interviews, and my awe at the repeated and unending cringe of Christian nationalist organizing. This is also trying to show the construction of what Reese Peck termed Fox populism, the performed lack of cultural capital to hide economic power. These kind of anti-biographies then unite diverse data sources, which I'm going to describe in chronological order. First, text to my friend saying how much I hate it here. Second, field notes. Third, analytic memos about this experience, as well as about media. Third, data coded from digital analytic tools, specifically Max Dictio. Then some more field notes about the data and the coding, and then some more field notes, and then also some more field notes. Okay, so we want to talk about uniting data across diverse contexts. I think programs like MaxDictio are really useful for storing and simple coding of data. They count things so you don't have to, as well as scraping comments. But the real analysis for me as an interpretivist comes only in the writing. And I would argue only in a writing that's a really thick description. So some people have mistakenly located the work of ethnography and empathy. But I think we can look at digital ethnography and ethnography of the right and say maybe in different ways this is not the case. Instead, I want to argue for a return to really thick description as the core element of ethnography, online, offline, or at their nexus. This focus on our own interpretative process shaped by the method allows us to better theorize how media and discourse is taken up and interpreted by ourselves and by others. Minute and theory-laden descriptions of our observations, allowing for a close exploration of the interaction of practice and ideology. The last and penultimate section of my talk then focuses on the way we write for others. Writing thick description as an act of critical beauty. So here we see the sun set on the remains of a Confederate monument, a more perfect example of critical beauty I think we could not find. All of this work is always first, and critiques of right-wing forms of knowledge production. It begins with the ways that they shape beauty to their own ends, this kind of Christianized humanistic discourse, which links a unified beauty, truth, and goodness to a defense of tradition and hierarchy, what they term teaching to make nature's aristocrats. So critical beauty begins with an analysis of how they make this inequality into meaning. My dissertation work, this was videos like PragerU, which is now official curriculum in Texas and in Florida, which would use the language of liberal explainer videos, this kind of avuncular common sense, a language without reflexivity, but also the tone and tenor of academia, something I've elsewhere called lanyard language, this kind of pseudo-academic pretense of objectivity, or perhaps an attempt to equate objectivity and masculinity, as we see here. They also, kind of the language that dresses in shirts with little checks. In both texts, their conflation of masculinity and objectivity is both subject and style. Their defense of hierarchy is stated explicitly in Christendom curricula's so-called battle papers, and in training in Christian apologetics, creating syllogisms to defend Confederate monuments based on the commandment to honor our fathers. They argue for the beauty of tradition, but we all must make clear that a column looks a lot better, a lot more romantic, without the slaver on top. So, if we're going to be critiquing right-wing ways of knowledge production, we might also find new ways of showing our own. This is me at Mardi Gras, which was the best part of doing fieldwork in Louisiana. So I'm on my way to an old sugar plantation outside New Orleans, curious how the city remembers its past and who wants to enjoy it. The tour bus is filled with squishy couples and too much air conditioning. I'm the only one there by myself. We pass a sign for Oak Alley Plantation's Valentine's Day brunch. Several women snuggle up to benevolently bored men. You know, the kind who elaborately perform soft patriarchy while waiting for their woman to buy shoes, because they are very much men and don't like silly women things, but they want you to know how good they are for waiting. Are they turned on by this tour? Will they go to this Valentine's brunch and drink bottomless mimosas with the ghosts of suffering? Get me some pearls to clutch. Alone and chilly imagining them at plantation weddings, I realize that all those chubby cupcake-looking say yes to the wedding dresses look like Southern Belle ball gowns. I'm warm with embarrassment. Pass me a racist old lady fan. I mean, my style's better, but I like fairy tale romance and also brunch. We get to the plantation and the sorority moms, accompanied by their sentient pairs of chinos, wander through the terrible luxury of it. The lines of live oak trees, shading some and lynching others, they stand there in the dining room, pointing to a set of silver or a well-constructed cupboard admiringly, as though it was home and garden television. The tour guide explains the house's construction to keep both the home and the chat breezy. It was built by Senegalese carpenters. There is no mention that they were brought over in chains. Once the fancy house tour is over, there is a brief mention of slavery and the individual cruelty of one owner before returning to a bar and offering you a mint julep. Here, affect and domesticity intertwine with terror, gendered visions of the happy home or the weekend romance, making cruelty normal, desirable for the tourists, one of our everyday engagements with white supremacy. I finished my research during COVID and the Black Lives Matter and wage theft protests in New Orleans, where service industry workers asked for fewer statues of slave owners and more of the city's tourism taxes to be returned to its workers. As we march past the empty Lee Circle, with its toppled statue of the Confederate general, 2 counter-protesters wave the American flag at us. They are so close to getting it. White supremacy isn't just plantations when you're living in a city where white people profit off of black labor. You might not go to Valentine's brunch, but who made your hangover eggs? Suburbs named after old plantations, but also built on them. Your house itself, a little symbolic plantation with those decorative columns. Maybe you don't have any lawn jockeys, but there's segregation and wealth gaps. So, critical beauty then, to return to Bourdieu's theories of reflexivity, perhaps here only as my own way of performing distinction, but I think also by returning to criticality to advance past certain doxa and sociolinguistics, beyond oppositions of precision and expression that date back to Labov and before, to celebrate pointed observations. Here I think of my mentor's mentor, Mary Buckhold's work on the whiteness of nerds, noting that they pretended not to know words that originated with black students, and she mocks them, saying it was the only time they admitted to not knowing something, equipped with as much information about the social world that they inhabit than any list of their vocabulary. Or at the level of genre, critical reflexivity moves beyond a binary of ethnographic qualitative writing I might call eat, pray, love ethnographies, and more so-called data-driven quant work. Using narrative for empirical reflexivity deepens and solidifies sociological observation. It is finally then an act of co-optation, much like the Spot, the End of the World, that took over an abandoned army base for midnight music, stealing and pirating genres and forms of expression for new forms of beauty, not as the conservatives' unchanging Platonic ideal, the stage genre, but some kind of critical, parasitical, and shifting beauty that takes back anything from thick description to perhaps here topic modeling, and invests it with new meanings, critique as a celebration or a carnival. In my next research, I'm trying to implement this better. For a future second book, once I write the first one, called Granola Nazis and Neoliberal Mystics, I tried to start this, but I ended up in the hospital. You still found me quizzing the nurses about their use of alternative health measures and anthroposophic medicine and all its strange cosmologies. It's not all medicine, but it is all data. This current project is looking at conservative gender and immigration politics in a space where right-wing and apparently left spaces around anthroposophy come together. Anthroposophy is a world of alternative health and wellness and spirituality, best known for education in Waldorf schools. That's how I got into it. So I'm interested in how they pick up on circulating discourses around gender ideology and opposition to so-called wokeness to portray a party that has long dominated the local politics as a strong countercultural outsider. But also how conservative politics make their way into spaces long deemed countercultural. Also look at this fun ad in the middle here for a family, which I think is marketed exactly the same way milk is. But anyway, this really isn't just about me. Reflexivity is certainly not autoethnography, and I'm not the only one playing with criticality, humor, and beauty in reflexive writing. So the head of the far-right fictions project at Brussels affirms to me that Nazis have no sense of cringe, and we should make fun of them. Well, the author of a very fine research monograph on historical Nazis says that his work is an exploration of their stupidity, their failures, while calling the women of the contemporary right a Prosecco stormfront, which is such a good term. A PhD student I met in Oslo looked at how her beauty was problematized to understand how motherhood was decoupled from sexuality in the spaces that she was looking at. Her supervisor calls for more beauty in writing, noting that the registers by which we perform objectivity are often anything but precise. Some of this research reminds me of policy speak. In one, there was a diagram of squiggles and an arrow, and it said synergy. Synergy of what for who? So, we don't have time. To conclude this methods talk, following again on this iterative process of exploring the production of knowledge, I want to reflect a little bit critically on reflexivity itself from these multiple angles and voices. I've tried to show how reflexivity shapes how we define our field and our role in the field, the way we can use digital tools, the way we write for analysis, and the way we communicate. We might continue this reflection to ask why reflexivity was then relegated often to a simple statement of positionality or to one about your outfit. Who performs reflexivity and in what ways? Why do we as women so often have to perform reflexivity by talking about our clothes? What registers are expected and who is asked and who is allowed to reflect? What does it mean that we are often asked to do reflexivity as a kind of self-minimalization, saying like, oh, this is an objective, do this kind of deconstructive reflexivity as women, instead of assuming a stronger, louder, more critical one? Why do I have to borrow Bourdieu? Why can't I just do it myself? Can we find new genres, new ways, or co-opt the ones that we have? What can we get these to do? What I want to do then is take critical feminist approaches to writing and turn this idea of empirical reflexivity that deepens and solidifies analysis. We might follow folks like Anastasia Zatea or Jonathan Rosa and others in linguistic anthropology who look, for example, at the word gap, which is a quantification exercise that is very well done in linguistic anthropology and looks at how quantification then does kind of linguistic racism in schools. Closer to my own work, Iko Mali's work on metapolitics, who said that we should look at language, but the real object of study is power. He also told me that I should order the fish, and he was right on both accounts. Okay, so in my attempts then to get beyond writing a book that would be something like Eat, Pray, Fascism, my journey of self-discovery into the right, I have often been told that I'm a little bit too political, to which I can say nothing but thank you very much.